For the applause, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker,
anticipation is a wonderful thing, Dennis O'Rourke.
Only modestly to improve the quality of tenancies by requiring smoke alarms and insulation. But what about the other things? What about heating standards? What about leak proofing, earthquake resistance, minimum size of accommodation, and so on? Now, Materia 2Re's intended SOP has a long list of other items to ensure a healthy home, and I disagree with a few, but certainly agree with most of them. And I would add a few more, by the way. But the point is that there needs to be a discussion on a broad range of minimum standards for rental properties in New Zealand, and we haven't had that, and this bill certainly doesn't reflect it. This bill, in fact, really only does three things. First of all, it requires smoke alarms, and they do have an excellent cost-benefit ratio of $1 for an $8.80 to $21.40 return, a superb return, and it's well worth the cost. The bill also regulates for technical needs for smoke alarms and insulation for the Chief Executive to take cases direct to the Tenancy Tribunal for persistent breaches of the legislation and to authorise a search of a property to get evidence where a breach may have occurred. And the third thing that the bill does, Mr. Speaker, is to streamline the process for the recovery of possession where a property has been abandoned. And all of those are very good things. So New Zealand First does support the bill, warts and all, but we think it should have gone a lot further. Now, Mr. Speaker, the Minister tonight in this House admitted that properties with 1978 insulation standards would never have to be upgraded to 2008 standards. Just think about that for a moment. Would never have to be upgraded to do that. Now, I acknowledge the argument for not requiring the upgrading to 2008 insulation standards, and the argument being that the economic cost is unjustified for what appears to be only an improvement of 5% in performance, but it may be a great deal more. I acknowledge that. But that is no good argument for leaving all of those properties forever not upgraded to 2008 standards and forever to have only those very substandard, I think very substandard, 1978 insulation standards. Now, Mr. Speaker, I would accept the need for a fair phase-in period of, say, 3 years to enable landlords to bring those properties up to standard, but New Zealand First would never accept the total cop-out which this bill will enact for those properties which now have only the 1978 standards of insulation. Furthermore, we say in our policy that there could be at least a tax incentive to upgrade to 2008 standards by allowing landlords to expense for tax purposes the whole cost of doing the upgrade in the year the expense was incurred. That would be a very good incentive and would help to make the process affordable. That's been New Zealand First policy for the last 5 years, and it's one that the government should adopt. In addition, New Zealand First is not satisfied that standards for heating are at all inadequate. There isn't much point, Mr. Speaker, of insulating a property which is not properly heated and not properly ventilated. There's just no point. And I think Mr. Twyford made that point as well in his speech. And this is actually the major flaw in this bill, which is not acknowledged by the government, and it should be. They should be doing a lot more about that. In fact, Andrew Little's Healthy Homes Guarantee Bill does require MB to set minimum standards for both heating and insulation. And that's what the government in this bill has precisely failed to do. The concept in Mr. Little's bill is to require tenancy agreements to state that the 2008 minimum standards are met, with significant penalties if that's not true. And that's the prescription I think that the government should be adopting. It's a pity that the government and the Labor Party can't get together to put their proposals into one bill, because if they did that, it would improve both pieces of proposed legislation. Mr Speaker, the Select Committee has recommended some welcome changes to the bill, and we support the increase of the penalties, especially for not complying with regulations for insulation, increased from $3,000 to $4,000. Still a relatively modest amount, I think, but it's a welcome increase. But New Zealand First disagrees with the recommendation for an amendment in clause 6.3, allowing a landlord to state in a tenancy agreement that despite making reasonable efforts, they have not been able to satisfy themselves of the extent of insulation in a particular property. That, we think, would be a cop-out too. Too easy to do, too easy to claim, and it shouldn't be in the bill. Now, houses with provable and adequate insulation, without provable and adequate insulation, should actually be excluded from the rental market in this legislation. People have to understand that if they're going to put an important service, which is what a rental property is, on the market, then like so many other things today, they have to meet minimum standards. If they don't, then it's not marketable and it shouldn't be allowed. It's as simple as that. However, New Zealand First does agree with the suggested change to clause 38 to widen the scope of materials for insulation, as long as they would still meet the 2008 standard for insulation. So that's a welcome change. Mr Speaker, for all of the reasons I've given, New Zealand First will continue to support the bill, but we think it's very disappointing indeed that it doesn't do a great deal more, as I've said, and most particularly, we believe about heating standards. The bill's failure to address that absolutely vital requirement is such a serious flaw that the bill is hardly worth having. It is that serious. And also, there is a long list of other items that also need minimum standards for healthy homes. As I've said, Materia Toure has set some of those out in her proposed SOP, and I have mentioned some in this speech. And New Zealand First will also support Andrew Little's bill to take up some of the slack, as I've said, which this bill doesn't even address. But the point is this: New Zealand First would do a lot more than both this bill does and what Andrew Little's bill would do. And I've mentioned some of those things, and many of them should be addressed in this bill right now. This is the opportunity, not at some later stage. So New Zealand First will vote in favour, but reluctantly, and we expect that a lot more will be done in the future, no matter which government might be in power in years to come.
I call